Well, we're going to talk about Frank. This story is called The Divine Twin. That's not the final name of it. I don't know what the final name will be, but that's a good start. Frank was the kind of man who lingered in doorways, was always either just coming from or on his way to the bathroom. He washed his hands in the cool water and thought, I want to have a baby. In the boardroom, he pressed the tip of his pen into the soft pads of his fingers, watching the circular impressions appear and then disappear until the inside of his left hand was covered in small dots of blue ink. His boss said, but I don't think this is any indication of a larger trend. I want to have a baby, he thought, and then said, I want to have a baby. His mother said, if you have a baby, you won't be the baby anymore. But this was a memory. He was having a memory now. What was that, Frank? His boss said. Karen from accounting said, I think he's having a memory. Memories are like children, his boss said, often unwanted and always unpleasant. Frank stood and showed his left hand. The tiny dots offended the room. Look, he said, I am a constellation, a night sky. Look how I construct myself. Frank, his boss said. Frank. What's your last name? Remind me. Frustum, Karen said. No, his boss said. I think it's Fustrum. Frustrum? Frostrum. Flotsam? The point is, Frank, his boss said, you can't give a name like that to a child. Too offensive. No, I would not procreate were I you, Frank, not at all. Frank doubled over as tendrils of pain emanating from deep in his muscles extended out across layers of fat and skin. He'd had these strange pains for as long as he could remember, but only now, approaching his 37th year, had they ramped up in frequency and intensity. The boss told him to take the rest of the week off. Figure yourself out, she said. Have a Mai Tai, a mojito, a margarita. Say the name. Roll it around your mouth like when you'd suck on a pebble to stay hydrated on long, hot days. Imbibe with aplomb was all she was saying. Frank went to a bar and ordered a Manhattan. Rolled the word around in his mouth as his boss had prescribed because she is, after all, the boss. He thought about how one would go about having a child. Could he perhaps seed himself? Was this possible? He searched, can I seed myself? But the results were unsatisfying and vaguely pornographic. He needed to be seeded. I need a seed, Frank thought. He had no woman to assist in this procedure. Women seemed to no longer notice him. They did not like the way he lingered. He once overheard a coworker say, he's just so expectant. Well, that's Frank, always lingering, always expectant, always cracking his knuckles at inappropriate times and leaning into ongoing conversations to comment on the weather. That's our Frank. The stranger had posted up next to him at the bar. He was not handsome, but not unhandsome. Frank did not know how to summate the appearance of a man, but if he had to put a number to him, the number would be 6. The stranger smiled at Frank, and Frank smiled back. Frank had brief and unethical thoughts. Frank had never thought about men, never considered his sexuality, and only defaulted to women because when he was younger, there were women around who agreed to sleep with him, and that was pretty much that. Frank lingered in the doorway of the bar at last call, and not long after, the stranger brought Frank back to his motel room, a seedy motel room, just the room Frank thought he needed. The stranger gestured for Frank to sit on the bed and opened a small fold of paper he'd produced from his pocket, cleared his throat, and flipped his shining hair. I am a crime, the stranger said quietly. My body a crime, my face a crime, my thoughts crimes, my words crimes. But I am not a criminal. Frank wiped a tear from his eye. Well, the stranger said, what do you think? Not bad, but I think it needs a what do you call it? I can't think of the term. Is it a riddle? It's been getting pretty warm reactions is all, the stranger said. Johns love my poetry. It's what keeps them coming back. Well, let me know if you have any notes. Frank nodded, not entirely understanding. Do you want some coke, the stranger said, snapping the radio's antenna until it was a small, hollow piece of metal. I could blow it into your ass. Some guys like that. I think just regular type, thanks, Frank said. Soon the stranger was parting Frank's buttocks with his hands, priming for insertion. Frank thought about how he'd never parted vaginal lips, but just went in. But maybe there are guys who like this spreading, Frank thought. Maybe this is the stranger's thing that he does. Eventually everything got to where it needed to be. There was some pain and performative grunting, and then it was over. Hey man, the stranger said, breathless. First time jitters? You were great, by the way. He accentuated this lie by putting a sweaty hand on Frank's shoulder. No, Frank said. I'm just feeling lonely right now is all. Oh yeah, man, the stranger said. We're all lonely, right? What's that quote about the benign indifference of the such and such? It doesn't matter. Do you want a towel or something? Frank curled himself into a small ball on the sheet smelling of stale sweat and cigarette smoke, ass in the air, half out of pain and half trying to speed impregnation. Is this part of round two, the stranger said. That's extra, man. No, Frank said. I want to have a baby. Whoa, hey, the stranger said. That's extra. Just take your money and go, Frank said, snot burbling in his throat. I need $50 more. You quoted me at 100. 50 for the nut, man. I don't have one blood relative who ever got cancer. My grams lived to be 101, and I'm 42. Look at me. Frank did not look. I got good genes is what I'm saying. Anyway, good luck with the whole conception thing. I think you're going to need it. Frank felt the cool night air on his warm buttocks as the stranger departed. Weeping ceased. In the stripes of the wallpaper, he saw an open jaw, a clenched fist. A bolt of pain surged through his body. A celestial child wavered like heat coming from a summer blacktop. He grasped, but could not will her into existence. 3 days of pissing on sticks, and there was no change. Frank was beginning to accept that he might not be able to bear a child. His doctor was no help either. Have you considered adoption, the doctor said, drawing her thumbnail down her chin and jugular. But not a child. God, no. I like to think I have a good read on those who are emotionally stable enough for child rearing, and I just don't see it here, Frank. I'm thinking more like a kitty or a yappy pup. I just know that I have this thing in me that wants to be formed, Frank said, or already has formed. A tapeworm, perhaps. I don't have a tapeworm. Great to shed a few pounds, the doctor said. And then, can I be frank? Frank pointed to his navel. Then who would I be? I'm speaking medically here. I'm going to prescribe you an antidepressant. I feel fine. You don't have to feel bad to feel better. What about the pain? Probably just psychosomatic, she said, and tapped her head with a pen, but I'm going to run some tests. At the bottom of her prescription, next to her scribbled signature and the generous number of refills, she doodled a small dog with an inky eyelash of a tail and 2 scraggly words next to his face. Yip, yip. On the pills, Frank no longer felt as a cerebral being, but more of a pardonless wanderer, pinballing between home, work, and the bathroom, just rubbing up against his life like you would a length of wool in a fabric store. The pup he adopted, a one-eyed and mangy approximation of a schnauzer, brought him a certain amount of joy that helped sate those ugly, nurturing feelings. Happily, Frank cleaned turds out of his loafers and swept fibers of floor rug into the dustpan. I will ask nothing of you, Frank said to the pup the day he brought him home. I require only that you continue to exist. The pup cocked his little head and drooled, extolling the myriad blisses of animal parenthood. At work, his body ached privately. 3 or 4 times a day, he went to the bathroom and grunted into his knuckles. Karen from accounting had also begun loitering around his desk, asking him about the pup and demanding to see pictures of the adorable little mongrel. To Frank, Karen was like a smudge in the corner of his eyeglasses. He kept trying to rub her out of his vision. She was just so beige, consistently wearing some shade of brown, tan, off-white, eggshell, or ecru. Her hair was a sandy melange of blonde and some slightly darker hues. At times, though, he felt bivouacked in her sheer buoyancy with which she managed to spear blindly into the heart of his isolation. On more than one occasion, Frank found himself laughing at her spirited recaps of a previous night's sitcom. On Thursday, she invited him for happy hour, stating that they really needed to get to know each other outside of the workplace. Against his better judgment, Frank suggested going to the bar where he met the stranger. Something about drawing Karen close to the secret part of his world excited and disgusted him. Karen looked around the bar and raised an eyebrow. "Why did you pick this bar?" she said. "It's closest to my apartment," Frank said. You know what it is, right?" "Sure," Frank said, not entirely certain, "but that's why I like it." Karen asked the bartender to line up 6 shots of cinnamon whiskey. She clinked Frank's glass and said, "Never more horny than when I'm hungover," and tipped back her shot. Frank struggled to catch up, pawned one shot off on a man to his right, and took the other 2. The liquor was not altogether disagreeable. In fact, he kind of liked it. He ordered 2 more, and Karen said something about him being a real party boy. Karen wrung herself into Frank's ear. She told him she went to college outside of Pomona and was voted the homeliest girl in her sorority, and had this habit of purposefully boring fraternity pledges at parties until they walked away for easier, less manic prey. She dropped out and spent most nights drinking yellow bellies with local grease fingers, spit roasting whole pigs over the sizzling engines of their hot rods. That is until she met Rick. But they'd recently separated, and she said she didn't want to talk about it, but did anyway, reiterating how great Rick was, how he was going to take real good care of their kids, and maybe when she put things back together, the door wouldn't be all the way closed on their marriage. But you have to cheat, she said. Otherwise, how do you know what you're getting into? Hey, let's get you a couple napkins. Frank dabbed at his eyes. Oh, it's not that, he said. I mean, that is a very sad story, Karen, but it's just been an emotional time for him. Things didn't go so well with conceiving. I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, she said, putting a hand on Frank's thigh, but there's always time for a scrimmage. Dusk came blue through the half-blacked windows of the bar. Frank scanned the room. The stranger had not arrived. Not that he could move on any impulses with Karen around. Frank said he should probably get going. Karen asked if she could escort him home, and he obliged. I just can't wait to meet that pup, Karen said excitedly. On the walk, Frank began drumming up excuses as to why he could not engage in sexual intercourse with her. He'd been having these pains. She was obviously still processing some really high-level grief. They were both so drunk, and that the dog might get the wrong idea. The pup was thrilled to meet a new person. This was something he had not done since coming to live with Frank. He scampered towards Karen's awaiting arms and ran his tongue across her cheeks. Karen giggled and littered his maddening face with kisses. Well, Frank said. I'd take a drink, Karen said. I might have something, iced tea or maybe some coffee. Well, gin would be preferable, or tequila. Frank filled 2 glasses with ice water and returned to the living room. Karen was in the beginning stages of undressing, but had got caught in her barrettes. Her face was now trapped in her flan-colored blouse. The dog was at her heel, tugging on her thick socks. Frank set the glasses down on 2 coasters and went to assist her, but was unsure of which way to take the garment. At this point, it might have just been easier for her to finish taking it off and just start over again. Frank, Karen slurred, her voice muffled by the fabric. Frank, we've got to get this off of me. I'm trying, Frank said. His phone began to vibrate in his pocket. He ignored it and tried unhooking Karen's wristwatch to free her sleeve. Do you ever think about time, Frank? Karen said. The way it moves, predictably forwards, occasionally backwards, but with no real trajectory. I haven't thought that much about it, Frank said. I have. It turns my stomach. It makes me sick. Karen said this, made some guttural noises, and then retched. Frank's phone vibrated again. He shrank away from the sour and vaguely cinnamon-smelling woman and checked his phone. His doctor had called twice and left a voicemail. He put the phone to his ear and assured Karen he'd help her get cleaned up in just a quick minute. His doctor was saying, nothing to be too concerned about, but concerning. No major rush getting back, but don't sit on it too long. Frank's stomach dropped, and a searing pain began at the ball of his foot, traveled slowly behind his knee and into his stomach. He sat down on the floor, sweating. Karen finally freed herself from the blouse. A yellow-brown mash slid down her naked torso and into Frank's rug. The pup burrowed his stubby snout into it. His doctor was tearing into a sandwich. Frank wilted at the nostalgic smell of saran wrap and cased meats. She made small noises of enjoyment, sucking dollops of mayonnaise from the tips of her fingers. Here's what's happening, Frank, she said. You've got an evil twin. I'm sorry? Fetus in fetu. It's not uncommon. 1 in 8 twin pregnancies or something. Basically, your mother's egg was fertilized by 2 spermatozoa, but can only sustain 1. The other fused your cute little baby fetus, and while you grew, it just leached off of you. The point is, there's a chance it'll metastasize. Do you know what that means? Frank nodded. So what I want to do is slice you open and carve that little sucker out. Easy peasy, in and out in a day or so. Well, what if I want to keep her? The doctor held up a slender finger while she chewed. Let's not gender it, Frank. It's basically a tumor with teeth, maybe some digits, but no heartbeat, lungs, nervous system, certainly no reproductive organs, and based on its position in your body, adjacent to some very important nerves, etc., it's likely what's causing those mysterious pains. Probably your depression, too. I'm not depressed, Frank said. The doctor slid a box of tissues across the desk. Frank blew his nose with a snotty honk. There was a large part of Frank that did not want to immediately cut this undeveloped child out of him. But perhaps these pains, these parental desires, were the discharges of his amorphous sister. His twin prisoner's tin cup banging on the bars of his corporeal cell, his flesh, his bones, his synaptic system. In that case, Frank did not want to be anybody's warden. In a few hours, they'd prepped him for surgery, and soon he was under. When Frank awoke, his doctor deposited a small jar wrapped in tissue paper and medical tape into his lap. On the table was a bouquet of cream and corn silk-colored flowers and a get-well-soon card signed, "Thanks and kisses, Karen." The next day, they released him from the hospital. He went home and set the jar on his bedside table. He watched the mass floating in the formaldehyde, a yellow molar and stray incisor embedded in the brownish flesh. The pup would not approach the jar, but growled when he happened to walk by. In the abyss of anesthesia, you do not dream. But Frank would fabricate a reverie. In it, he spoke to his sister. She told him that she wasn't upset that he'd been so eager to gestate all those umbilical resources their mother had allotted for the both of them. She wasn't angry she'd been absorbed by his own needy fetus, but instead had enjoyed the 36 years she got to be a bodily bystander, a furtive organ in Frank's life. As the doctor had promised, the pain had ceased, but in their place was left a sucking vacuity. Frank knew that he'd made a mistake, realized that these pains were not manifestations of his sister's desire for separation, but instead flares sent up into his own night sky to remind him that he was not alone, that he'd never been alone. He knew now that she was not an evil twin, but a divine one. He examined his fresh stitches, cutting through a swath of stray body hair, bifurcating a mole and looping neatly into the flesh of his love handle. He began to tug at the seams of his incision. The dog yapped feverishly, frothing, eyes rolled into its head. A mouth, red and wet, opened, burning hot. You do not have to feel bad to feel better. That was true. But really, Frank thought, there's only one way to feel whole.